Good morning, everybody. Sue has provided us with, I think, a very clear context as to how childhood and adolescent trauma impacts on young people across the life course. And she's identified for us the range of events which can constitute this trauma. I've been asked to focus on trauma in the backgrounds of the specific offender groups which I've researched over the past 20 years or so. And this means that I'll be talking about the heavy end of juvenile offending, and that's to say about those young people who are locked up in young offender institutions and later in adult prisons for a very long time. But I guess that if we look at the worst that can happen to a young person in the criminal justice system, this also enables us to look at what work might be done to prevent them reaching this position in the first place. The question which has occupied much of my working life as an academic has been, why do young people become violent? And in this session I'd like to trace for you the key pieces of my own work, which over 22 years have led to what I believe is now the necessity to identify and work with trauma experiences in the backgrounds of these young people. And this is particularly so in the face of increased emphasis by successive governments, and indeed by society itself, on the need for public protection. Before I talk about my research, though, I'd just like to briefly invoke the wider professional, societal and global context for developing greater understanding of trauma and violence in young people. Some of you will remember, and some of you will be too young to remember, violence and murder perpetrated by children and young people became high profile in the UK during the 1990s, largely as a result of the murder in February 1993 of 2-year-old James Bulger at the hands of two 10-year-old boys. The blurred video image of this innocent toddler, hand in hand with his two young killers, as they led him through a Liverpool shopping precinct to his ultimate death, is one which will probably remain in the minds of all who saw it for the rest of their lives. At that time, little attempt was made to seek an explanation for the two 10-year-olds' behaviour. It seemed sufficient for the media to apply the label evil. It appeared acceptable for any hint of the welfare philosophy applied to children under the age of 14 in other European countries to be firmly supplanted by the notions of punishment and retribution. It seemed uncontentious, as David James Smith reported in his book The Sleep of Reason, for the trial judge, when passing sentence, to threaten them by carrying into the courtroom a black cap and white gloves, the traditional artifacts of the death penalty. And thus these two young children, publicly named and reportedly severely traumatised, came to be sentenced to detention during Her Majesty's pleasure under Section 53(1) of the Children and Young Persons Act 1933, with a minimum of 15 years to serve, longer than the period they had yet lived, though this was eventually reduced to 8 years by the European Court. There was little recognition of them as children, who prior to their offence would normally have been seen as separate, vulnerable beings with distinct needs. And there was a complete absence of information about the litany of abuse and loss in their backgrounds, which David James Smith and Blake Morrison, both serious journalists, later recounted in their books about the case. Cases of young people killing other young people around the world, which came after the Bulger case, have included the Colorado school killings in the US by two 11-year-olds, and the brutal gang rape and killing of a 14-year-old schoolgirl in South Africa by a 15-year-old, and the recent case of gang rape and murder of a 23-year-old woman on a bus in India by a 17-year-old boy and 4 adults, all of which produced public outcries similar to those in the UK, and petitions for the return of the death penalty in South Africa, which Nelson Mandela had abolished at the end of apartheid. In India, the adults did receive the death penalty, though the 17-year-old received 3 years detention. In a study of child violence in South Africa, Wandile Zwane observed that the tendency now is to emphasise the lurid details of the brutal acts committed by children. Glaringly missing from the media reports are the reasons behind this type of violent behaviour. And of course, as Sue said, the reasons for violence and murder by youngsters vary enormously in relation to their individual circumstances and their respective cultures. And in Rwanda, where I advised on research about the feasibility of the Gacaca mediation process for young people still in prison for genocide crimes, both the young people and the communities to which it was proposed they would return remained traumatised and fearful. But whatever the circumstances, if we are seriously to consider the prevention of such violence by the next generation, we need to examine much more closely the nature of the problem about asking this question, why? I would argue that any professional working with these young people needs first to consider the wide-ranging backdrop of violent images to which we as individuals and societies are exposed in our daily lives. In parallel with images of violence perpetrated by children, which I've described, have developed other powerful media projections of violence perpetrated upon children in the form of child abuse, physical, sexual, emotional, or combinations thereof. In the UK, these consistently impact upon the populace as a consequence of public inquiry, either because of child death within the family or the mismanagement of suspected child abuse, or abusive practices in children's homes and elsewhere. According to the particular circumstances, those with professional responsibility, notably in recent times children's services, have been criticised either for intervening too much or intervening too little. Public feeling seemingly runs as high about the increase of state interference in domestic and family life as it does about that same state's failure to prevent the death or abuse of a child. It's a highly emotive issue which touches us all at some level. And so it represents an awesome challenge for professionals, both in the social care and criminal justice sectors. The contemporary primacy of violence is also demonstrated across the world in military and religious architecture, statues, art, music, press, television coverage of more than 300 wars since the end of World War II. And of course that coverage is particularly engraved on our consciousness at the present time in respect of military conflicts in Iraq, Afghanistan, and the conflicts arising from the Arab Spring in Libya, Egypt, Syria, and elsewhere. Further, violence is enshrined in a range of criminal justice systems to criminalised antisocial behaviour, that is to say, torture and other forms of physical retribution, and capital punishment, all of which in some countries may be applied to children and young people, despite wide ratification of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. Similarly, Save the Children's report, entitled The Small Hands of Slavery, reminds us that mental and physical violence to victims of child prostitution and child labour is to be seen not only in Asia, the Far East, Central and South America as popularly imagined, but also in parts of the so-called developed world, including our own. And physical violence between family members is frequently seen as normal for many societies. As an example, early in the new millennium, the British government took the decision not to make the disciplining of children by physical chastisement, i.e. smacking, illegal. At national and international levels, then, it can be argued that the cultural legitimacy of violence is reinforced to successive generations of youngsters, and that in some contexts this in itself can be traumatising. It certainly produces confusing models and messages for a young person moving through developmental stages and trying to gain a sense of identity and morality against a complex backcloth of interacting sociological, cultural, psychological, and other influences. To move on to a discussion of my own research on trauma as a background to violence, in England and Wales during the 1990s, I undertook 2 studies for the Prince's Trust. The first was a small-scale investigation of the experiences and needs of 25 Section 53 offenders. These were children and young people between the ages of 10 and 17 inclusive, detained for murder and other grave crimes under Sections 53(1) and 2 of the Children and Young Persons Act 1933, which has now been replaced by Sections 90 and 91 of the Powers of the Criminal Court Sentencing Act 2000. That's a bit of a mouthful. But a completely unanticipated byproduct of this survey was the discovery of evidence, both in young people's accounts and in their case records, that 50% of the sample had a background of some kind of child abuse. And that is to say, physical, sexual, emotional, organised ritual, or combinations of those. Related staff who were interviewed estimated that the true figure could be as high as 90%. That was difficult, certainly for us at the time, to believe. The other phenomenon revealed in the survey was the high prevalence of traumatic loss in the shape of bereavement and separation from family, which the young people had not been helped to understand or come to terms with. So the next step, when we managed to get some more research funding, was to survey a much higher proportion of cases to try and establish a reliable figure for the prevalence of abuse and loss in the lives of the Section 53 population, drawing on a statistically significant number of detainees. And at the time, the population of Section 53s of all ages, including those who'd progressed to the adult prison system, as many of them do, numbered 615, of whom 584 were male and 31 female. The Department of Health didn't monitor ethnic origin during that period. Our method was to examine a random sample of 200 centrally held files to note down professionally confirmed evidence in them of child abuse and loss, and where this evidence was partial or ambiguous, to interview the young people themselves about these issues. A total of 72% of respondents was found to have experienced abuse, which we defined according to government department guidelines. And this was divided as follows: emotional 28.5%, sexual 29%, physical 40%, and organised ritual abuse 1.5%. Combinations of abuses 27%. A total of 57% had experienced significant loss via bereavement or cessation of contact, usually with a parent, and in a small number of cases both. In only 18 out of 200 cases we studied were there no reported evidences of abuse and or loss. In other words, the total number of Section 53 offenders who had experienced one or both phenomena was 91%. The total number who had experienced both abuse and loss was 35%, suggesting that the presence of a double childhood trauma may be a potent factor in the lives of violent young offenders. Indeed, there seems little doubt that child abuse and childhood experience of loss, when no effective opportunity is provided for the child to make sense of these experiences, constitutes unresolved trauma, which is likely to manifest itself in some way at a later date. Many children become depressed, disturbed, violent, or all three. And as the American Psychiatric Association reports, girls tend to internalize and boys to externalize their responses, and there's a whole argument there about cultural influence. Not untypical of the group we interviewed is Darren, age 32, when we interviewed him. He'd so far served 15 years, 11 of them in adult prisons, for grievous bodily harm and attempted rape committed when he was a teenager. He recounted a childhood which included the loss of his father when he was 3, regular beatings from that time by his mother, sexual abuse by his mother's lover, being locked in a dark cellar with rats, and sexual abuse followed by suicide attempts after he was placed in a children's home. In other words, he was abused in the home as well. George, aged 23 at the time of interview, was sentenced to be detained for the physical and sexual assault of a woman belonging to a religious group that he joined for support. His attack caused her serious and lasting injury. At the time of the interview, he'd served 8 years, the last 2 in an adult prison. His father had died when he was 5, and his stepfather subsequently physically and sexually abused him. His case is not unusual in that this early abusive and traumatic background had not come to light before his very serious offence, despite long-standing professional involvement with him and his family. Had that abuse been recognised, and the child and his family managed differently as a result, it's possible that the long-term outcome, not just for George, but for many of these young men, might have been different. This is not to suggest that child abuse or loss are the only potential causes of violent offending. Indeed, cause is notoriously difficult to establish, as Sue has highlighted. Nor is it to suggest that every abused child becomes an offender, rather that abuse is sufficiently prevalent among such offenders to be regarded as a key traumatic factor, which involved professionals need to have in mind as they engage with children and young people along the dichotomous welfare justice continuum. Recurringly, research evidence reminds us of the seemingly paradoxical but nevertheless close relationship between the offender's own victimisation at some point in their lives and their later offending. Examples of this include the Edinburgh Longitudinal Study of Youth Transitions and Crime by Smith and McVie, and the research review of risk and protective factors for violent behaviour in youth, conducted by Lersel and Bender. This kind of background of victimisation was also almost universally true of the small number of young women in our sample. A third study of what by then had become Section 90 and 91 offenders was conducted for the Youth Justice Board in 2003. Prison Service Order 4950 had stated that regimes for those under 18 should do all they can to positively motivate young people via individually tailored programs. And so 3 enhanced YOI regimes for vulnerable detainees had been set up, and our research team evaluated the effectiveness of one of them. The findings were largely positive and are reported elsewhere. They're not for me to discuss here. But following on from the identification of links between trauma and later violent behaviour in the Prince's Trust study, we worked in this study with a psychologist to administer a test for post-traumatic stress disorder. All of the 24 young men on this particular enhanced unit, unsurprisingly, were found to have damaged and disturbed backgrounds, and we wanted to know if PTSD was or had been experienced as a result. The test for post-traumatic stress disorder at that time was called PTSD-1. It took the form of an interview, which has demonstrated very high internal consistency and test-retest reliability. It was devised to correspond closely to the American Psychiatric Association's diagnostic standards and criteria for PTSD, though both the criteria and PTSD testing instruments have increased in sophistication since then. The first question, the PTSD-1, asks whether the respondent has experienced an unusual, extremely distressing event. So that's the first criterion for PTSD diagnosis. And then answers in the affirmative triggered more detailed questions in 4 sections, which represent the remaining 4 criteria for PTSD, which are that the traumatic event is persistently re-experienced, the person persistently avoids stimuli associated with the trauma or experiences a numbing of general responsiveness, that persistent symptoms of increased arousal are experienced, and that symptoms must have persisted for 28 days before diagnosis. We were able to interview 21 of the 24 young men on the enhanced unit on 2 occasions, with an average gap of around 9 months. Sorry, I'm just checking my slides here. That's right. 1/5 or 4 respondents scored positive for current PTSD at first interview, but only 2 of those still scored positive by the second interview. The traumata cited by this group were being bullied, military conflict, terrifying dreams, and for one, the violent offence he himself had committed. 3 others scored positive for lifetime PTSD, that is to say PTSD which has been experienced previously but is not current. 2 of this group also cited their own violent offences. The third cited military conflict in his country of origin. The test authors did acknowledge that their cut-off points for PTSD diagnosis could be too rigid, and so it is also worthy of mention that 6 young men had scored higher on a single indicator. If they had scored higher on a single indicator, 3 of them would have reached the level of current PTSD and 3 would have reached the level of lifetime diagnosis. Other traumata cited by those for whom PTSD was not found included further examples of bullying and violent racism and witnessing the deaths of family members or friends. However, many of the experiences were still categorised as problematic in their lives by these young men. Although only a minority of these cases of these violent young offenders fit neatly into the criteria for PTSD, the findings generally beg questions as to whether these young men, detained for violent offences and long periods, should routinely be screened for PTSD, and what if a positive diagnosis results should then be done to address this situation. And I want to end my discussion of the research by talking about related incidences of trauma in the backgrounds of 2 young people who had committed murder. One of these was not in the abuse and loss study, but was unusually reported in some detail by the press at the time of that study. And this was a 14-year-old boy who we'll call Ben. He was charged with bayoneting another teenager to death in a gang attack. This followed an alleged attack with a baseball bat on another boy. The reporting psychiatrist told the court that the young defendant had witnessed his mother stab his father to death in their home when he was aged 6. And so he saw his father dead and his mother taken away to jail for manslaughter, effectively a double bereavement, instant double bereavement. Ben reported persistent mental images and nightmares about this event, and he'd been deeply affected by the traumatic loss at a very young age of both his parents. His response to emotional events generally was one of numbness. This is, one of the criteria I talked about before for PTSD. And interestingly, we found ourselves as researchers often reading about this word numbness, also about lost memory or frozen emotion in description of our respondents. Ben told the psychiatrist that when he was attacking the other teenager, he'd seen the image of his father dying, and the psychiatrist reported the murder of Ben's father by his mother as clearly the most traumatic incident in his life. And yet the prosecution refused to accept Ben's plea of guilty to manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. Clearly those concerned were not persuaded of any link between the 2 events, despite considerable body of research available at the time on the effects of this particular form of trauma, that's to say the witnessing of parental violence and murder. The second case in our abuse and loss study had not been included in the figure of 72% experiencing abuse because there'd been no professional corroboration of it. But we ourselves suspected it based on a range of disjointed records, and I will quote what we wrote in the research report. A young woman of 15, who we'll call Jennifer, was convicted of the murder of an elderly woman in her locality. She had exhibited disturbed behaviour from an early age and was described by her GP as a very distressed child needing an urgent child psychiatry referral, following a urinary tract infection and an inability to use her right leg. She became unable to walk for 11 weeks, but a later report described the condition as a functional paralysis for which no cause could be found. Surrounding this situation was domestic violence and disruption at home. The existence of this combination of factors would have raised the antennae of many of those accustomed to working with abused children, but the records contained no evidence of any formal abuse investigation or even of any probing questioning. So that's what we wrote at the time. And about 8 years later, I attended a seminar about violent young offenders, as one does, at which a respected psychotherapist from the Bowlby Centre was presenting a case study. And after listening to this study for some minutes, I realised that the case she was talking about was that of this very same young woman, Jennifer, with whom she'd been working in prison for a number of years. She recounted a history of sustained and systematic abuse in the life of this young woman, which made it only too clear how traumatised she was when she had committed her own crime. The psychotherapy had worked very well. Jennifer was one of the lucky ones who got access to this. And it had helped her to understand why she'd done what she'd done, to come to terms with it, and the steps she would need to take to avoid such violence in the future. She was now released and doing extremely well. The point to make in both these cases is that if their childhood trauma had been recognised and worked with, 2 other human beings would still be alive, and these 2 young people themselves would have been most unlikely to have ended up incarcerated at the heavy end of the criminal justice system. Such evidence as is available about protective or resilience factors, for example that of Loesel and Bender, suggests that the 2 main factors that aid recovery from trauma are education, that's really access to and ability to benefit from sympathetic schooling, and to be able to share the story of the traumatic experience with at least one responsible adult who will listen, believe, help the young person to understand and to move on from that experience. But creating the space and opportunity for children and young people to talk in this way is of the essence. It takes time, it takes listening skills. As Bill Ewell, in a critique of issues and findings related to childhood trauma, observed, one reason why professionals did not believe that children were subject to physical or sexual abuse or suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder was simply that they never asked them. But the action that needs to be taken is not only by the currently beleaguered public sector professional, it also requires public and political will and understanding. So what are the ways forward for working effectively with these undoubtedly challenging, frequently disturbed and sometimes continuingly dangerous young people? We've said some of these things before, but they always bear repeating. I'd first advocate the raising of the age of criminal responsibility in this country to at least 14 years, so that it becomes commensurate with that of most other European countries, where such youngsters are channeled through the childcare system rather than through a punitive and often re-abusive criminal justice system. I would second invoke the United Nations Riad guidelines, which state that deprivation of the liberty of a juvenile should be a disposition of last resort and for the minimum necessary period, and should be limited to exceptional cases. Thirdly, professionals need to be equipped with a firm knowledge base about the significance of childhood trauma, which will help to recognise the signs of phenomena such as PTSD, and they need training and resources available to enable them to intervene appropriately before high-risk behaviour becomes entrenched within young adulthood. And fourthly, young people who've been abused and otherwise traumatised need communities which support them by validating rather than ignoring their experiences, making it more acceptable for them to report, describe and discuss these traumatic events, and placing emphasis on prevention, also offering support to parents in difficulty, providing parenting classes in schools. Perhaps surprisingly, parenting classes have been quite a success story in YOIs over the last decade, but much more work needs to be done to enable them to take off in the outside community. Professionals have a key role to play here in linking with their local communities and communicating with them about the importance for community safety of reaching an understanding of young violent offenders and negotiating with them the action that each sector can appropriately take to minimise the risks of this happening in their communities. And finally, there's a need for full integration of research programmes into the process of policy formulation and effective application in the criminal justice system for young people. In other words, politicians, policymakers and sentencers need to listen to and act on research findings. And this too is an area in which professionals can play a major role by becoming research-minded and also by helping to represent not only their own views but those of the public, victims and their families and the youthful perpetrators themselves, moving society towards a greater sense of collective responsibility in the process. Our responses to young violent offenders can in this way become much more proactive, confident and accurate in the very complex arena which spans child welfare and youth justice, and which frequently finds the victim and the offender located in one single damaged young person. Thank you.